Hello guys, and welcome back to Sleepy Battle Stories. Tonight, we step into a winter so bitter it felt determined to freeze history in place. Yet instead, it became the night a revolution thawed its own despair. This is the Battle of Trenton, December 26, 1776. A gamble born from necessity, carried by frost-numbed hands, crossing an ice-choked river in darkness, when defeat was certain, unless the impossible was attempted. Imagine the Delaware River before dawn, blocks of ice grinding softly like distant stones, a silent column of men shivering without complaint, boots soaked, muskets guarded beneath coats, resolve burning quieter but warmer than firewood in the cold. At their head, a general who refused surrender to doubt, George Washington, not chasing glory but chasing a chance. No sweeping battlefield awaited them, only a town, a target, and a storm of snow muffling movement like nature conspiring in whispers. Hessian soldiers sleeping after Christmas celebrations, confident the season had paused the war for them, but revolutions do not wait for spring. Then came the sudden unravelling, drums distant, then closer, then lost beneath musket bursts. A surprise strike, swift, overwhelming, decisive. A victory not grand in scale, but monumental in consequence. Proof that hope, even when fragile, could still carry a nation forward. This was the morning the revolution learned a new shape, not the power to win every fight, but the power to rise again after falling. So, if you love stories where courage crosses rivers at midnight, where belief survives winter's verdict, leave a like and subscribe. Not for spectacle, but because you know history's quietest turning points are often the loudest. And before we begin, in the hush between cold night and warm rest, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? No matter the distance, you're here, sharing the warmth of a story born from the cold. Now, let the snow drift softly through. Your imagination, let the oars cut quietly through the dark water, and let's ease into the winter crossing that changed the war, one quiet miracle at a time. The winter of 1776 descended upon the American colonies not as a gradual change of season, but as a relentless physical force, a grey and bitter punishment that seemed to mirror the crumbling fortunes of the revolutionary cause. It was a year of audacious declarations and profound despair, a year in which the heady idealism of Philadelphia had met the brutal empirical reality of British military might. By late December, the flame of rebellion, so brightly lit in July, guttered on the verge of extinguishment. The social order of the colonies, that intricate web of allegiances to crown and community, had been torn asunder, leaving a ragged, uncertain landscape where neighbour eyed neighbour with suspicion, and the very concept of American was a fragile, untested idea. In the cities held by the British, New York most prominently, a semblance of the old order persisted, enforced by bayonets and the presence of Hessian auxiliaries, their foreign tongues and disciplined brutality, a constant reminder of the price of defiance. In the countryside and among the scattered, dwindling camps of the Continental Army, a new and desperate order was being born, one defined by deprivation, frostbitten resolve, and a gnawing fear that history would remember them not as founders, but as fools. The theatre of war had contracted to a narrow strip of land between the Delaware River and the Atlantic. General William Howe, commanding His Majesty's forces, had pursued George Washington's army with a methodical, crushing pressure across New York and New Jersey, driving them from fortress to frozen field in a relentless retreat that seemed to have no end but surrender or dissolution. Howe, comfortable in conquered New York, believed the campaign was effectively over. The rebel army was broken, the spring would see its final mopping up. He had dispersed his forces into winter quarters across New Jersey, a confident network of garrisons designed to hold the territory and reassure the local populace, and those many colonists of wavering loyalty, of the Crown's firm and permanent control. It was a logical, conventional military decision, born of an era where armies did not fight in the dead of winter. The war, in the eyes of the British High Command, was adjourned. On the western bank of the Delaware River, the embodiment of the rebel cause was a man standing at the precipice of utter ruin. General George Washington, at 44, carried the weight of a world upon his shoulders. His ambition, once perhaps tempered by a gentleman's desire for honour and station within the British military system, had been transformed, forged in the fire of rebellion into a staggering singular purpose, the preservation of the army and the cause it represented. His fears were not personal but existential. He feared the dissolution of his forces, the scorn of posterity, the collapse of the grand experiment in self-government into anarchy or renewed subjugation. His contradiction lay in his very person, a Virginia planter of reserved dignity, now leading a ragged egalitarian multitude from New England and beyond, a man who craved order and discipline presiding over a force defined by its intermittent chaos. He wrote with a quill of iron, pleading with the Continental Congress for supplies, for men, for time, his letters a chronicle of a slow-motion disaster. His army, that collection of citizen soldiers, was melting away. Enlistments expired with the turning of the year. Men, lacking shoes, their feet wrapped in rags, left bloody prints on the frozen ground as they trudged toward home, their patriotism frozen out of them by hunger and cold. The great cause was being measured now not in principles, but in the number of fit men under arms, and that number was dwindling towards zero. Across the river, in the small unassuming town of Trenton, the British detachment and its Hessian garrison lived in a different reality. Commanded by Colonel Johann Rall, a career soldier from Hesse-Kassel, the town was a bastion of professional military confidence. Rall was a man of action, brave to the point of recklessness, respected by his men for his personal courage in the European style of warfare. His ambition was straightforward: to perform his duty, earn the praise of his masters and the fear of his enemies, and perhaps secure a more glorious command. His fear, if he admitted one, was not of the rebels, but of dishonour, of failure in the eyes of his prince. His contradiction was a common one among the professional soldiers of Europe, a deep-seated contempt for the martial abilities of the colonial militias, a contempt bred from victories on Long Island and at White Plains. To Rall and his grenadiers, the Americans were a disorderly rabble, incapable of a coordinated, disciplined military action, especially in such vile weather. This conviction hardened into a dangerous certainty. Reports from loyalists and patrols of increased activity across the river were dismissed. Preparations for the town's defence, urged by some of his subordinates, were neglected. Why build extensive fortifications against an enemy that was vanishing? Trenton was not a frontline fortress. It was a comfortable winter billet. The tensions here were not of impending battle, but of a garrison growing complacent, their commander's pride blinding him to the desperation taking shape just a few miles, and one icy river away. The landscape itself became a character in this drama, a silent arbiter of fate. The Delaware River, usually a broad highway, was choked with ice, great jagged flows grinding against one another in the current, a treacherous barrier for any boat. The roads of New Jersey had dissolved into ribbons of frozen mud, hard as iron by night, a sucking morass by day. The sky was a lid of low leaden cloud, threatening more snow, holding the feeble sunlight at bay. In this world of grey and white and bone-chilling cold, human enterprise seemed puny, futile. The social contract that bound the army to its commander, the soldiers to their cause, was being tested not by musket balls, but by the elemental need for warmth and food. The old order of British rule promised a return to stability, to the known rhythms of life under a distant king. The new order promised only a continued struggle against the greatest military power on earth, and a winter that showed no mercy. Before any battle could be fought with powder and shot, a battle was being fought against despair itself, and it was a battle Washington was perilously close to losing. The stage was set not for a grand clash of empires, but for a desperate final gamble, an act that would either be the death rattle of the revolution, or the moment it drew a shuddering, miraculous breath back into its lungs. Within the American camp, hidden tensions festered beneath the surface of shared misery, a complex web of rivalries and unresolved conflicts that threatened to unravel the army from within. The Continental Force was not a monolith, but a fragile coalition of regional interests and personal ambitions. Officers from the different colonies eyed one another with a familiarity bred of shared hardship, but also with a latent competitiveness. New Englanders, who had borne the brunt of the early fighting, sometimes viewed the Virginians and men from the middle colonies with suspicion, questioning their commitment. The very structure of the army was a source of friction. Washington's authority, granted by Congress, was continually tested by the limited terms of enlistment and the democratic, sometimes insubordinate spirit of the militias. A deep-seated tension existed between the professional soldiers Washington longed for, a standing army in the European mould, and the citizen soldiers who formed the bulk of his forces, men who saw themselves as free individuals answering a call, not subjects to be drilled into automatons. Among Washington's own staff and general officers, ambitions and anxieties simmered. Major General Charles Lee, the eccentric British-born officer captured just days before, had been a source of constant, subtle opposition. While a prisoner, his absence was perhaps a relief to Washington, but Lee's prior delays and arrogant missives had already sown discord. Other officers, like the daring and impulsive Brigadier General Hugh Mercer, or the steadfast but weary Nathaniel Greene, competed for Washington's favour and for command of the dwindling effective troops. Greene in particular wrestled with the logistical nightmare of supplying the army, his task made impossible by a collapsing commissary and a bankrupt Congress. His fear was not of battle, but of the army disintegrating from sheer want. Then there was the young, fiercely intelligent Alexander Hamilton, captain of artillery, chafing at his limited command, his boundless ambition seeking an outlet on a larger stage. These men were bound together by loyalty to Washington and the cause, but the strain of constant defeat and deprivation wore those bonds thin. The soldiers in the ranks harboured their own, more immediate grievances. The promise of regular pay was a bitter joke. They were paid in depreciating continental currency, or not at all. Their clothing was in tatters, their bellies empty. The social contract of military service, obedience in return for provision, had been broken by the political failures of the distant Congress. This bred a sullen resentment, a feeling that they were being asked to sacrifice everything for a government that could not even provide them with shoes. Men from Pennsylvania looked at the New Jersey militia, who had largely melted away to protect their own homes, with contempt. The very idea of America was abstract when faced with the immediate physical reality of a frozen Jersey winter. Unresolved, too, was the conflict between the desire for home and the pull of duty. The sight of men whose enlistments had expired packing their few belongings and leaving camp was a daily trauma for those who remained, a silent argument that played out in every man's heart. Could they be blamed? The cause seemed lost. The logical human decision was to return to one's farm, one's family, and survive. Across the Delaware in Trenton, the tensions were of a different, more professional, but no less dangerous nature. Colonel Rahl's disdain for his enemy was not universally shared among his subordinate officers. Some, like Major Friedrich von Deschau, who commanded a contingent of the Lossberg Regiment, were more cautious. They saw the vulnerability of their position. Trenton was situated in a bowl, with hills rising to the north and west, perfect ground for an attacking force to command. The town had multiple roads leading into it, making it difficult to defend without a fortified perimeter. A few junior officers and sergeants, veterans of European wars, felt a prickle of unease. They urged the construction of redoubts, the setting of pickets farther out. the establishment of regular and vigilant patrols along the riverbank. Raoul brushed these concerns aside. His bravery was unquestioned, but it was the bravery of the battlefield, of the direct confrontation. The tedious defensive work of fortification was beneath him, a confession of fear unworthy of a grenadier. The tension then was between professional prudence and arrogant confidence. The Hessian regiments themselves, the Rahl, Lossberg and Kniephausen, harboured their own quiet rivalries, each proud of their own lineage and prowess. They were mercenaries, yes, but professionals with a deep pride in their craft. Their loyalty was to their colonel and their prince, not to the British cause, and certainly not to the geography of New Jersey. This created a subtle disconnect, a focus on their own unit's performance and honour rather than the holistic defence of the position. Furthermore, the relationship between the Hessian garrison and the local populace was a delicate, unresolved conflict. Trenton was not hostile territory in the way Boston had been. There were loyalists here, and many more who were cautiously neutral, waiting to see which way the wind blew. The Hessians, however, were foreigners in a foreign land, their discipline strict, their manner often brusque. Requisitions for food and firewood, while standard military practice bred resentment. Stories of plunder, some true, many exaggerated, filtered through the countryside. The people of Trenton watched the Hessians with guarded eyes, and the Hessians, aware of their isolation, viewed the locals with a suspicion that made them less likely to heed warnings that might come from them. A hidden tension, therefore, existed between the garrison and the very ground it stood upon. They were an island of martial order in a countryside of ambiguous loyalties, and they knew it, even if their commander chose to ignore the implications. Thus, as Christmas approached, the two forces existed in parallel states of tension. In the American camp, it was the tension of dissolution, of internal fractures threatening to split the army apart from its own despair and conflicting desires. In Trenton, it was the tension of complacency, of a professional force allowing its expertise to be dulled by contempt and the comforts of winter quarters. One army was straining against its own collapse, held together by the sheer will of its commander and the last fraying threads of a revolutionary ideal. The other was relaxing into a false security, its strength dissipated not by hunger but by overconfidence. The river between them was more than a physical obstacle. It was a psychological barrier, each side viewing the other through a lens distorted by their own circumstances. For Washington, the Hessians were a formidable professional obstacle, the sharp tip of the British spear. For Rahl, the Americans were a nuisance, a shattered force of no consequential threat. Both perceptions were about to be violently recalibrated, and the hidden tensions within each camp would soon be forced into the open by the relentless pressure of events. The incident that shattered the fragile, frozen status quo was not a single musket shot or a sudden cavalry charge, but a slow, grinding crisis of expiration. As the last days of December 1776 bled away, so too did the legal existence of the Continental Army. The enlistment terms for a vast portion of Washington's men were set to conclude at midnight on December 31st. This was no surprise. It was a ticking clock woven into the very fabric of the Army's creation. Yet its arrival now, in this moment of utter desolation, acted as the destabilizing force that made all prior suffering seem merely preparatory. The army was not just starving and cold, it was, by law and custom, about to vanish. This administrative deadline transformed the strategic landscape more decisively than any British manoeuvre. Washington faced the prospect of standing on the banks of the Delaware on New Year's Day with a force that could number fewer than 1,000 effectives, a bodyguard incapable of opposing even a modest British foraging party, let alone holding a state or a nation. This forced upon Washington and his war council a brutal clarity. Passive endurance was no longer an option. Waiting out the winter meant accepting the dissolution of the cause. The status quo of retreat, of desperate defence was over, because soon there would be nothing left to defend. They had to react, not to an enemy attack, but to the implacable calendar. In this crucible of necessity, the plan that had been simmering in Washington's mind, a plan so fraught with risk it bordered on madness, transitioned from a desperate notion to the only remaining option. They would use the expiration of the enlistments not as an epitaph but as a catalyst. They would attack. The target was Trenton. The rationale was stark. Only a dramatic, victorious stroke could possibly hope to reinvigorate the public spirit, shock the British from their complacency, and, most immediately, persuade some of the men whose time was up to stay, inspired by success and the prospect of bounty. The decision was reactive, born of absolute exigency, but within it was a kernel of breathtakingly aggressive action. Washington's character now moved to the forefront. The cautious Virginian, the Fabian strategist who had avoided a general engagement for months to preserve his army, was prepared to stake everything on a single roll of the dice. His fear of the army's dissolution overrode his fear of a battlefield defeat, for in this calculus, the two were becoming synonymous. He began to issue orders with a renewed, focused energy. Artillery, under the command of the young Henry Knox, was to be prepared for movement, a Herculean task given the weight of the cannon and the state of the roads. Boats, the Durham boats used to transport iron ore on the river, were to be gathered and concealed. Officers were to quietly identify those men willing to extend their service for 6 weeks in return for a bounty, a financial plea to patriotism. The plan was audacious in its simplicity, a 3-pronged crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night, with 2 diversionary forces downstream, and Washington's main force of some 2,400 men crossing 9 miles north of Trenton, then marching south to launch a coordinated dawn assault on the Hessian garrison. The reaction among the ranks to these preparations was a mixture of numb obedience and flickering, incredulous hope. For men with bare feet and empty stomachs, the idea of an offensive seemed almost absurd. Yet there was a psychological shift. The endless, passive suffering was being replaced by a purpose, however dangerous. They were being asked not just to endure, but to act. This in itself was a form of relief. The internal tensions between regions, between despair and duty, were momentarily subsumed by the sheer scale of the task before them. Grumbling did not cease, but it found a new object. Not the Congress or the cold, but the practical, immense difficulties of moving an army and its artillery across an ice-choked river at night, in a storm. Their reaction was not one of patriotic fervour, but of weary professional focus on an impossible job that had to be done. Meanwhile in Trenton, Colonel Roll's reaction to the increasing signs of activity was one of reinforcing his own preconceptions. Loyalist farmers brought reports of boat gathering. His own patrols noted increased rebel presence along the western bank. On Christmas Day, a Tory appeared at his door with a note reportedly found on the road warning of Washington's movement. The story, perhaps apocryphal but deeply revealing, holds that Roll, engrossed in a game of cards, tucked the unread note into his waistcoat pocket. Whether literally true or not, the symbolism is perfect. The destabilizing incident, the impending expiration of the Continental Army, meant nothing to him. He could not conceive of an enemy so desperate it would attack in such conditions. His reaction was to further cement his garrison's routine. He ordered the traditional Christmas celebrations to proceed. The men, already enjoying their holiday libations, would stand their normal guards, but no extraordinary measures were taken. The storm that was gathering, both meteorological and martial, was, in Rull's view, a reason for the rebels to stay in their huts, not a cloak for their movement. His reaction was the ultimate expression of professional contempt. He saw the same signs as his more cautious subordinates, but interpreted them through a lens of unwavering confidence. The status quo for the Hessians was one of secure winter quarters. Washington's desperate gamble only served in Roll's mind to confirm the rebels' disorganization and lack of serious intent. The incident that forced Washington to act was invisible to Roll, and thus his reaction was a non-reaction, a fatal commitment to business as usual in the face of a gathering hurricane. Thus, on Christmas Day 1776, two armies existed in radically different psychological spaces, both shaped by their reaction to the same looming deadline. One army, pushed to the brink of non-existence, was mustering its last reserves of physical and moral strength for a bid at resurrection. The other, believing itself secure in its superiority, was settling into the comforts of a holiday, its vigilance blunted by tradition and arrogance. The Delaware River was no longer just a boundary between forces. It was a boundary between perception and reality, between a desperate grasp at fate and a smug dismissal of it. The weather, too, began to react. As afternoon faded into Christmas evening, the sky, already grey, thickened. A cold, penetrating rain began to fall, soon mixing with sleet, then turning to a heavy, wet snow, driven by a biting northeast wind. It was a storm of uncommon violence, a howling chaos from the elements that seemed to side with the Hessians, to make Washington's plan impossible. But for the Americans, there was no turning back. The clock was ticking, the enlistments dissolving with every passing hour. Their reaction was set. They would cross, or they would cease to be. From the crucible of necessity, alliances of desperate purpose began to coalesce, and latent loyalties were subjected to immediate physical tests. Washington's plan required not just the main force under his direct command, but the synchronized action of two other columns. Brigadier General James Ewing was to cross with his Pennsylvania militia directly opposite Trenton to seize the bridge over Assunpink Creek and block the Hessian escape route south. Downstream, Colonel John Cadwallader with the Philadelphia Associators and Rhode Island troops was to cross at Bristol, create a diversion, and if possible, attack the Hessian outpost at Bordentown. This three-pronged scheme was an alliance of disparate units, regular Continentals, local militia, and volunteer battalions, each with their own commanders and esprit de corps, now asked to function as a single weapon in the most challenging conditions imaginable. Their loyalty was not just to the cause, but to the feasibility of the plan itself. Would the militia, often derided for its lack of staying power, hold its part of the bargain in a freezing storm? Could the coordination across miles of storm-swept river and countryside be maintained without any means of rapid communication? Within Washington's own column, the alliance between the commander and his key subordinates was paramount. Henry Knox, the rotund, energetic bookseller turned artillerist, was now entrusted with the near-miraculous task of transporting the army's cannon. His loyalty to Washington was absolute, his can-do spirit infectious. He became the logistical apostle of the operation, rallying his men with booming optimism. Nathaniel Greene, recovered from illness, and the steady John Sullivan were to command the two divisions of the attack force. Their loyalty was being tested not in council, but in their ability to transmit Washington's desperate resolve down through the ranks to the shivering privates. Then there were the foreign allies, men like the Prussian volunteer, Baron von Steuben, who was not yet the drill master of Valley Forge but was present, observing, his professional eye doubtless horrified and impressed in equal measure. The Marquis de Lafayette was still months away from joining the cause. This knight belonged to the native-born and the long-suffering. The alliance was between Washington and every man who picked up a musket, a pike, or an oar. It was a contract sealed not by parchment, but by shared exposure to the elements and the dim collective hope of striking a blow. Opposing sides in the clearest sense were already defined, the besieged revolution against the crown and its auxiliaries. But within that macro conflict, micro sides were clarifying on this night. On the riverbanks, the side of action was represented by the boatmen from Marblehead and Gloucester, fishermen from Massachusetts commanded by Colonel John Glover. These men, in their distinctive tarred trousers and jackets, were a breed apart from the farm boys and tradesmen of the army. Their loyalty was to the sea and the river, to a task that played to their unique strengths. As the storm raged, it was Glover's Marbleheaders who managed the impossible ballet of loading men, horses and cannon into the unstable Durham boats and poling them across the black, ice-riddled torrent. They formed an indispensable, professional alliance with the army, a symbiosis of land and water power without which the entire enterprise would have foundered before it began. They were tested not by Hessian musketry, but by the river itself, and their loyalty to their dangerous craft ensured the operation's continuation. As the night deepened, the tests of loyalty became personal and physical. Men huddled in the boats, soaked to the skin, their muskets rendered useless by the driving sleet and snow. The crossing, planned to be complete by midnight, stretched on for hours. The storm intensified, the wind shrieking, the ice floes crashing against the wooden hulls with terrifying force. Could loyalty to an idea withstand this? For some, it could not. Desertions occurred, men slipping away from the marching columns on the Jersey side, seeking any shelter from the relentless storm. But for the majority, the very extremity of the conditions forged a perverse solidarity. They were in it together past the point of no return. To turn back now was as dangerous as to go forward. Their loyalty shifted from the abstract cause to the man next to them in the boat, to the unit, to the immediate chain of command that was all that stood between them and chaos. Washington himself, a monumental cloaked figure on horseback, riding along the line of march to offer quiet words of encouragement, became the physical embodiment of the alliance. He was sharing their suffering, and that meant everything. In Trenton, the alliances were those of routine and hierarchy. The Hessians' loyalty was to their regiments and their colonel, but this loyalty, so strong on the parade ground, was being subtly eroded by the circumstances Roll had created. The storm, far from putting them on alert, drove the pickets inward, huddling for shelter. The celebration of Christmas, with its extra rations of rum and wine, further dulled the edge of vigilance. The alliance between the garrison and its duty was weakening with every hour of festivity and every blast of the gale. They were loyal to their profession, but their professional judgment was clouded by a shared, command-sanctioned belief in their own security. The opposing side, the Americans, existed in their minds as a distant, broken foe, not as a palpable threat materializing out of the storm just a few miles to the north. Theirs was an alliance of mutual reassurance, a collective decision led from the top to believe the night held no danger. By 3 a.m. on the 26th, the clear opposing sides were at last physically positioned for the confrontation, though only one side was aware of it. Washington's force, finally across the river, was assembling on the Jersey shore at Green's Point. They were 9 hours behind schedule, soaked, frozen, and with dawn perhaps only 3 hours away. The plan for a pre-dawn attack was in tatters. Here, loyalties were tested in council. Some officers, their men exhausted and their powder wet, argued for retreat. To march now was to risk being caught in the open, in daylight, by a rallied enemy. It was the moment of supreme test for Washington's alliance with his generals. He listened, then made the fateful decision. They would go on. Victory or death, he reportedly said, the phrase reflecting the binary, all-or-nothing nature of their gamble. The test was passed. Greene and Sullivan affirmed the order. The alliance held. They would march the 9 miles to Trenton, storm or no storm, daylight or no daylight. The opposing sides were now irrevocably set on a collision course, one trudging forward through blind determination, the other slumbering in a false peace. The lines were drawn not just on a map, but in the very spirit of the two forces, one tested and hardened by the ordeal of the night, the other untested and softened by the comforts of it. The decision to press on from the riverbank in the face of a shattered timetable and exhausted troops was the first in a cascade of choices that carried the weight of irreversible consequences. To turn back would have meant a catastrophic, demoralizing recrossing of the Delaware under a possibly clearing sky, exposing the operation as a fiasco. It would have confirmed the Hessians' contempt and broken the last spirit of the Continental Army. Washington's choice to continue, therefore, was not merely tactical, it was existential. It committed 2,400 men to a daylight approach, sacrificing all hope of surprise in the traditional sense. The consequence of this decision was to transform the nature of the intended attack. It would no longer be a stealthy strike at dawn's first light, but a desperate direct assault in full morning, relying now on the continued negligence of the enemy and the sheer, shocking audacity of their appearance. The march south toward Trenton became its own trial, each step a compounding of the initial choice. The storm, which had been a torment during the crossing, now became a paradoxical ally. The howling wind and driving sleet obscured the sound of their movement, the clink of equipment, the tramp of feet, the rumble of gun carriages. The consequence of the storm's persistence was to grant them an auditory cloak, even as it stole their timeline. The column divided as planned, with Sullivan's force marching along the river road and greens with Washington attached, taking the inland Pennington Road. This division of force was another decision with irreversible stakes. If one column was discovered and engaged prematurely, the other might be cut off or find itself attacking a fully alerted town alone. Success depended on their simultaneous convergence on Trenton from two directions, a complex maneuver for a professional army in good weather, let alone for this force in a blizzard. The consequence of splitting was the risk of defeat in detail. The potential reward was the envelopment of the enemy. Along the way, smaller, immediate decisions piled up, each closing a door. When advance parties encountered isolated Hessian outposts or sentries, the order was to use the bayonet, to take prisoners silently, to allow no warning to escape. This was done with brutal efficiency. The consequence was the elimination of the enemy's early warning system, but it also meant that from this point there could be no pretense of a peaceful return. They were committed to bloodshed. As the columns pressed on, men began to falter. Some, suffering from exposure, collapsed by the roadside. The decision, implicit and cruel, was to leave them. To stop the entire column for each fallen man was to accept failure. The consequence was a hardening of the heart, a prioritization of the mission over the individual, a necessary ruthlessness that defined the nature of the endeavor. They were becoming, in their suffering, a weapon honed to a single, terrible purpose. In Trenton, the previous day's decisions were now yielding their own inexorable consequences. Rahl's choice to forego fortifications meant there were no defensive works to man, no redoubts from which to pour a devastating enfilading fire on approaching columns. His decision to allow the traditional Christmas observance meant that a significant number of his men were suffering the effects of a night of celebration, their reflexes slowed, their senses dulled. The consequence of his contemptuous dismissal of intelligence was a garrison unprepared, mentally and physically, for an attack. His most fateful decision to not establish distant fortified pickets meant the first real warning would come not from a skirmish line a mile out, but from the sound of musket fire at the town's edge. These were not mere errors in judgment. They were active choices that had systematically disarmed his command, leaving it vulnerable to the precise kind of shock assault that was now descending upon it. As the grey, storm-lit morning of December 26th arrived, the consequences of all these accumulated decisions began to interlock. Around 8 a.m., the American columns, despite the conditions, reached their jump-off points north of Trenton. They had marched through the worst of the night, and now they formed for battle. The men, their powder hopefully kept somewhat dry under hats and coats, were a pitiful yet determined sight. Washington, riding before them, offered a final, brief exhortation. The die was cast. The decision to attack was now being executed. At the same moment inside Trenton, the consequences of the Hessians' routine took shape. The storm had delayed the normal morning patrols. Some soldiers were just beginning their day. Others were still sleeping off the night's festivities. Colonel Rull was at his quarters, likely breakfasting. The town was stirring, but it was the stir of a winter morning in garrison, not of a garrison on a war footing. Then the irreversible moment arrived. American advance guards moving into the outskirts of the town encountered a Hessian picket post. A shot rang out, then another. The brief, sharp exchange was the spark. The consequence was immediate and electric. In Trenton, the sound of musketry, distinct and close, cut through the muffling snowfall. For the Hessians, it was a sound that contradicted their entire reality of the past weeks. For the Americans, it was the signal to advance in earnest. Officers shouted commands. Drummers, their drums damp but serviceable, beat the long roll. The two columns began their descent into the town, their lines of battle taking shape on the high ground, looking down into the streets where the Hessians were now scrambling, a confused anthill of blue and brass. The decisions of the past 24 hours, to cross, to march, to attack, had converged on this single frozen field of inevitability. There was no going back. The quiet of the storm was broken, and the next hour would decide whether the consequence of Washington's gamble would be the resurrection of a cause or its final bloody interment in the snowy streets of an obscure New Jersey town. The point of no return was not at the riverbank, nor on the march. It was here in the first cracks of musketry, as illusion met reality with violent force. The first cracks of musket fire on the outskirts of Trenton were not the disciplined volleys of European line battle, but scattered urgent pops like the snapping of frozen twigs. Yet in the muffled world of the snowstorm their report was electric, a violent rupture of the morning's false peace. For the advancing Americans the sound was a release. The long, agonizing night of uncertainty was over. The moment of action, of finally striking back, had arrived. For the Hessians stumbling into the streets of Trenton, it was a dissonant shock, an alarm that contradicted every assumption of the past month. The battle did not begin with two armies arrayed in open field, but as a sudden, violent intrusion into the domestic space of a winter garrison. From the high ground at the north end of town, General Washington and General Greene watched as their division began its descent. The storm worked now as a spectral ally, a shifting grey curtain that obscured numbers and confused the defenders. American units, their uniforms a motley collection of hunting shirts, civilian coats and tattered regimentals, emerged from the veiling snow like phantoms. They moved not as a single solid wall, but in smaller, more flexible bodies, following the natural contours of the land and the layout of the streets, a tactic born of necessity that proved devastatingly effective in the urban setting. From the parallel river road, General Sullivan's division pressed in from the west, their objective to seal off the escape route to the Assunpink Creek Bridge. The plan, though hours late, was unfolding with a terrible, precise symmetry. Inside the town, chaos was not immediate, but it was swift. The initial response from the Hessian outposts was one of professional, if confused, resistance. A guard company near the Pennington Road under the command of a young lieutenant formed a ragged line and delivered a volley into the advancing shadows. The Americans, many with powder too damp to fire, responded with a bayonet charge, their silent, steel-tipped rush more terrifying than any gunfire. The psychological impact was immense. The Hessians were trained to stand and trade volleys, to see their enemy across a field. This close-quarter assault by men who seemed to materialize from the storm itself was unnerving. The guard company was overwhelmed, many surrendering on the spot, others turning to flee deeper into the town, spreading panic in their wake. Colonel Johann Rull, awakened by the musket fire and the growing cacophony of drums and shouts, was at first more annoyed than alarmed. His quarters were in the house of a local merchant, and the reports he initially received suggested a mere raiding party, a nuisance action by a local militia. This was the final, fatal expression of his contempt. He dressed hastily, buckling on his sword, and emerged into the street to take command. What he saw must have begun to chip at the edifice of his certainty. The air was thick with swirling snow and gun smoke. The sharp, distinctive crash of American 6-pounder cannon, Henry Knox's guns now unlimbered on the high roads, echoed through the town, sending grape shot tearing down the long, straight streets. This was no militia raid. This was coordinated artillery, the hallmark of a serious army. Raoul's response, once his mind accepted the reality, was characteristically aggressive. He was a fighter, not a defensive calculator. He rejected suggestions to withdraw and form a defensive perimeter on the open ground to the south near the Assunpink. Instead, he sought to do what he knew best, meet the enemy head-on and drive them back. He ordered the assembly of his regiments in the open area near the town's centre, the parallel streets of King and Queen. The familiar beats of Hessian drums answered the American calls, a discordant martial duet. The Roland-Lossberg regiments began to form their lines with a discipline that was magnificent under the circumstances, their blue coats and brass-fronted mitre caps a stark, orderly contrast to the ragged advancing tide. But they were forming in a killing zone. Washington's forces held the commanding ground at the head of these streets, and Knox's artillery, with clear lines of fire, began to exact a horrifying toll. Solid shot and grape shot ploughed into the forming ranks, turning orderly lines into bloody disarray before a single Hessian volley could be returned in kind. The battle's early minutes thus established its defining character. It was not a stand-up fight between lines of infantry, but a battle for control of space, of street corners, of orchards, of houses. American riflemen and musketeers, many from the frontier, took up positions behind fences, stone walls, and in the second stories of homes, firing down into the exposed Hessian formations. The Hessians, trained for open field warfare, were disoriented. Their instinct was to form line and advance, but every street became a funnel of death, raked by cannon fire and targeted by hidden marksmen. The very geography of Trenton, which Raoul had dismissed as irrelevant, had become a trap. The Americans, fighting in a manner that European professionals considered irregular, even dishonourable, were using the terrain with a brutal practicality. The moral ambiguity of war, the chasm between professional honour and effective survival, was laid bare in those snow-clogged streets. For the Continentals, this was not about glory. It was about survival and the leverage of any advantage, however ungenteel. As the engagement intensified, the battle fragmented into a series of violent close-quarter struggles, each a microcosm of the larger clash of wills and methodologies. Colonel Raoul, finally grasping the scale of the attack, attempted to seize the initiative. He led his rallied regiment in a direct, courageous but tactically disastrous charge up King Street, aiming to silence the most destructive of Knox's artillery positions. The sight was stirring in its old-world gallantry. A veteran German colonel on horseback, sword held high, shouting commands to his grenadiers as they advanced through the sleet into the heart of the American fire. For a moment, the sheer force of their disciplined advance pushed the American skirmishers back, but the charge was channeled into the narrow street, a perfect funnel for the gunners on the high ground. Knox's cannons, loaded with deadly grape shot, roared again. The effect was slaughterous. The head of the Hessian column seemed to dissolve in a mist of red. Men fell in heaps. The charge faltered, then broke, survivors reeling back into the comparative cover of side alleys and doorways. Simultaneously, on the western side of town, General Sullivan's division was executing its critical mission. While the Hessian attention was fixated on the thunder from the north, Sullivan's men swept in from the river road, meeting stubborn resistance from the Kniphausen regiment. Here the fighting was house to house, yard to yard. Americans used their knowledge of the town's layout, often provided by local guides, to outflank Hessian positions. A contingent under a young Captain William Washington, a distant cousin of the general, and Lieutenant James Monroe, future president, led a charge to capture 2 Hessian cannon positioned at the junction of streets leading to the Assunpink Bridge. Both officers were wounded in the furious hand-to-hand struggle for the guns, a testament to the ferocity of the close combat. Their success, however, was pivotal. It secured the western approach and began to tighten the noose. The psychological strain on individuals reached its peak in these moments. For a Hessian grenadier, the world had transformed from the orderly routine of garrison life into a nightmare of invisible enemies, screaming cannonades and falling comrades. Their professional pride kept them fighting, but a deep-seated confusion, a sense of the world turned upside down, began to erode their cohesion. For the American soldier, the strain was different. It was the pressure of holding together, of maintaining the attack after a night of unspeakable hardship. The fear of failure was now mingled with the dawning, incredulous hope that they might actually win. This hope was a potent stimulant, pushing exhausted men forward, giving them a fierce energy in the clash of bayonets. Key characters were now defined by their actions under this supreme pressure. Henry Knox, his voice booming above the din, directed his artillery with the calm precision of a master craftsman, each shot calculated for maximum havoc. His earlier decision to bring the guns across the river, against all odds, was now paying a devastating dividend. Nathaniel Greene, cool and methodical, managed the northern front, ensuring pressure was maintained without allowing his units to become overextended in the urban maze. And George Washington was everywhere. A towering figure on his horse, he exposed himself to fire repeatedly, riding to points of crisis to steady the line, to urge men forward. His presence was a tangible force, a bulwark against the chaos. In his demeanour, calm, resolute, in the thick of the danger, he embodied the reversal of fortune he sought to achieve. He was no longer the fleeing commander of a doomed army. He was the aggressive architect of a stunning reversal. For Colonel Roll, the pressure was of a different, more corrosive kind. It was the pressure of a collapsing paradigm. His brave charge had failed. Reports filtered in that the enemy was in the town from multiple sides, that the bridge to the south might be cut. The elegant simplicity of a stand-up fight had been denied to him. He was being outthought, outfought, by the rabble he despised. In this moment of crisis, he reverted to another standard tactic. He attempted to wheel his beleaguered regiments and break out to the southeast, toward open ground and a potential route to Princeton. It was a sound decision, born of a soldier's instinct to escape a trap. But as the Hessian units disengaged and began to move in a new direction, their cohesion, already frayed, began to unravel further. The orderly retreat became a crowded, confused movement, made more difficult by the snow and the press of American forces now flooding into the town from the north and west. The battle was reaching its tipping point, and the momentum, born of surprise, terrain, and desperate resolve, belonged entirely to the Americans. The climax of the battle arrived not with a single cataclysmic event, but as a swift, crushing convergence of American advantages in Hessian disarray. Colonel Roll's attempt to pivot his forces toward the Princeton road was met with a fresh and devastating obstacle. A body of American troops, likely from Sullivan's command, had successfully moved to block the southeastern exit from the town. As the Hessians streamed into this new corridor, they were met with sustained musketry from yet another formed line. They were now surrounded on three sides, with the icy Delaware at their backs. The open field Roll sought was a phantom. The trap was sprung shut. In this maelstrom, the final, decisive personal drama unfolded. Colonel Roll, realizing the utter hopelessness of their position, made one last, desperate effort to rally his men for a breakout. Mounted, a clear target, he shouted orders, trying to reform a square or a column that could punch through. It was an act of consummate bravery, a fitting end for a soldier of his temperament. But in that moment, the truth of this new kind of warfare which he had refused to see finally claimed him. Musket fire from the surrounding American lines found its mark. Raoul was hit, 2 balls striking him in the side. He slumped in his saddle, was helped from his horse by his men, and carried into the nearby Methodist church, which was being used as a field hospital. With his fall, the last vestige of organised Hessian resistance collapsed. The soul of the defence, its courageous but flawed commander, was extinguished. What followed was not a general surrender, but a rapid piecemeal capitulation as the American net tightened. Isolated pockets of Hessians, leaderless and with no avenue of escape, began to lay down their arms. Some fought on stubbornly in small groups, selling their lives dearly in the tradition of their profession. Others, seeing the futility, threw their muskets into the blood-spattered snow and raised their hands. The sounds of battle, the crash of cannon, the rattle of musketry, the shouts and screams began to diminish, replaced by the calls of American officers rounding up prisoners and the cries of the wounded. The storm, which had been a constant roaring witness, began to relent slightly, as if the violence had momentarily exhausted the very elements. The strategies of both sides had been put to the ultimate test, and one had failed catastrophically. Raoul's strategy of contempt, of neglecting defence, of dismissing intelligence, had resulted in the total tactical disintegration of his command. Washington's strategy of audacious, high-risk movement, of using the storm as a cloak, of splitting his force for envelopment, had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. The chaos that unfolded in Trenton's streets was the direct result of this collision between preparedness and presumption. The truth that replaced illusion was stark and humiliating for the Hessians. The rabble was capable of brilliant, ruthless generalship and fierce, effective fighting. The illusion of invincibility that had accompanied the Hessian troops across the Atlantic lay shattered amidst the slush and the fallen mitre caps. For the Americans, a different truth replaced their own illusions of despair. They were not a broken army. They could march through a hellish night, fight a professional enemy on equal and superior terms, and win a complete, unambiguous victory. The psychological transformation in the ranks was instantaneous and profound. The weariness, the hunger, the cold, all were momentarily forgotten in the surge of exultation and stunned disbelief. They moved among the captured Hessian cannon, the stacked muskets, the long lines of prisoners, with a new bearing. They were victors. This truth was as essential to the cause as the captured material. It was the spark that could reignite the fire of the revolution. The battle had lasted, in its intense phase, perhaps no more than 90 minutes. But in that brief, violent span, the entire narrative of the war in the north had been irrevocably altered. The immediate fallout of the fighting was a scene of stark contrasts, a tableau of victory and defeat painted in the grim palette of a winter morning. The Americans, flushed with the heat of battle and sudden triumph, now faced the sobering administrative tasks of the victor. The town of Trenton was a wrecked sanctuary. Streets were littered with the detritus of combat, discarded weapons, torn regimental colours, broken artillery limbers, and the dark, melting stains in the snow. The wounded of both sides filled houses and churches, their moans a lower, more pathetic chorus beneath the shouted orders of the captors. American surgeons, themselves lacking supplies, worked alongside captured Hessian medics in a grisly fellowship of suffering. The scale of the victory began to dawn on Washington and his officers as reports filtered in. Nearly the entire Hessian garrison had been killed, wounded, or captured. The final tally would be staggering. Approximately 22 Hessians killed, 83 wounded, and between 900 and 1,000 taken prisoner. The Americans captured 6 brass cannons, dozens of wagons, hundreds of muskets, and precious supplies of powder, shot, and flour, a king's ransom for an army that had possessed nothing the day before. American casualties were miraculously light, 2 privates frozen to death on the march, and perhaps 5 wounded in the battle, including the young officers Washington and Monroe. This disparity was not just a military success, it was a work of art, a near-perfect execution of a desperate plan. For the Hessian prisoners, the fallout was one of profound shock and humiliation. Stripped of their arms and their pride, they were herded into formation under guard. Their world had inverted. Just hours before, they had been the masters of this town, confident professionals serving a distant prince. Now they were a long blue column of captives, destined for prison camps in Pennsylvania. The professionalism that had failed them in battle now reasserted itself in defeat. They marched with a stoic, disciplined air, but their eyes betrayed a bewilderment that went deeper than tactical reversal. They had been defeated not by a greater army, but by a concept, by audacity, by perseverance, by a willingness to dare what they themselves would never have contemplated. Washington, however, had no time to bask in the triumph. The immediate fallout included a pressing and dangerous strategic reality. He was now deep in enemy territory with the exhausted army, his prisoners, and his booty. The British forces in Princeton and Bordentown were only a few hours' march away, and once the shock of Trenton's fall wore off, a powerful counterattack was inevitable. His army, though victorious, was spent. The men had been without sleep for over 36 hours, had marched miles in a blizzard, and had fought a battle. To remain in Trenton was to invite annihilation. A critical decision had to be made, and quickly. Should they attempt to hold the town? Should they retreat back, across the Delaware with their prizes? Or was there a third, even bolder course? The captured supplies offered a brief respite. Washington ordered food distributed immediately. For the first time in weeks, many of his men ate a full meal. This simple act of nourishment was as important as the victory itself. It tied their personal survival directly to the success of the operation. The bounty of war was not abstract. It was hot bread and captured salt pork in their bellies. Meanwhile, the commander convened a swift council with his generals. The consensus was clear: they could not stay. The river behind them, still choked with ice, was a barrier to swift retreat and reinforcement. The decision was made to recross the Delaware that very day, returning to the relative safety of Pennsylvania with their prisoners and cannon. It was a prudent, if anticlimactic, conclusion to the dramatic raid. The victory would be secured, not by holding ground, but by escaping with its fruits intact. As the short winter daylight began to wane on December 26th, the American army began its exodus from Trenton. The return crossing was, if anything, more arduous than the first. The men were at the absolute limit of their endurance. They now shepherded a long, sullen column of Hessian prisoners and dragged the heavy captured artillery. The storm had abated, but the river was still a treacherous gauntlet of shifting ice. The process was slow, dangerous, and exhausting. It continued long into the night and through the next day. Yet the mood was fundamentally different from the grim silence of the Christmas night crossing. There was a palpable, if weary, euphoria. Men spoke of the fight, of the Hessians' surprise, of the thunder of their own cannon. They had a story to tell now, a shared epic of suffering and redemption. On the Pennsylvania shore, the fallout of the victory began to ripple outward, first as rumor, then as confirmed report. Express riders were dispatched to Philadelphia and to the Continental Congress, which had fled to Baltimore. The news was incredible, almost unbelievable. After a relentless season of defeat, here was a victory, clear, complete, and dramatic. For the Congress it was a lifeline, a validation of their cause, and their commander at the moment both seemed most bankrupt. For the populace of Philadelphia and the surrounding countryside, it was an electric shock to morale. The narrative of inevitable British triumph was broken. The fox-hunting gentlemen of Virginia had outgeneraled the professionals of Europe. The long-term impact on the people and systems involved was instantly set in motion. For the Continental Army system, Trenton proved the viability of a standing professional force capable of complex operations. The victory became the cornerstone argument for longer enlistments and better support. For the British system, it was a profound embarrassment and a strategic shock. General Howe's comfortable winter narrative was shattered. The pacification of New Jersey was revealed as a mirage. He would now be forced to react, to redeploy troops, to take the rebel army seriously once more. The war, which he thought was in a state of suspended animation, had been violently restarted. Most importantly, the victory permanently altered the psychology of the rebellion. Before Trenton, the revolution was an idea defended by a retreating, dissolving army. After Trenton, it was a cause with a future. Soldiers whose enlistments were set to expire on December 31st now had a reason to stay. The bounty offered for a 6-week extension was no longer a plea to empty pockets, but an investment in a winning enterprise. Men who'd been packing their kits now reconsidered. The army, which had been a vessel draining of hope, began to refill. Washington's desperate gamble had paid the highest possible dividend. It had bought time, it had bought credibility, and it had bought, for a few more critical weeks, the continued service of the men who were the revolution's last best hope. The battle was over, but the campaign and the war had been resurrected. The victory at Trenton, though stark and complete, existed in a precarious bubble of time and exhaustion. As the last of his men, prisoners, and captured cannon were ferried back to the Pennsylvania shore on the 27th of December, General Washington faced not a triumphal respite, but a swiftly closing window of vulnerability. The army was a spent force, operating on the last dregs of nervous energy. Men collapsed into sleep where they stood, their bodies finally surrendering to the 48 hours of continuous exertion. Yet, in the commandeered farmhouses that served as headquarters, there could be no rest. The immediate, intoxicating success had to be translated into lasting strategic advantage, or it would fade into a brilliant but ultimately meaningless raid. The British response, Washington knew, would be swift and violent. The lion had been stung, and it would lash out. Across New Jersey, the repercussions of Trenton were already vibrating through the British chain of command. In Princeton, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marhood, commanding a brigade of British regulars, received the first confused, alarming reports. In New York, General William Howe's winter complacency was shattered. The news was an affront, a violation of the professional military order. A Hessian garrison, part of the finest auxiliary troops money could buy, had been surprised and captured wholesale by the ragged remnant of an army he had declared beaten. Howe's reaction was a mixture of fury and professional recalibration. Orders flew to General James Grant, overall commander in New Jersey, and to Lord Charles Cornwallis, who was on the verge of boarding a ship for England on leave. Cornwallis's voyage was cancelled. He was ordered to take command of a substantial force, march into New Jersey, and restore order decisively. The objective was no longer mere pacification. It was the eradication of Washington's army, which had just proven it was not only still alive, but dangerously capable. Washington, sensing this gathering storm, made a decision that revealed the depth of his newfound strategic confidence. Remaining in Pennsylvania was to cede the initiative. The river, once a barrier protecting his retreat, was now a barrier to his influence. The New Jersey militia, witnessing the victory, were beginning to stir. To abandon the state now would be to squander that awakening and leave those who had dared hope to British reprisal. Furthermore, his own men, their enlistments due to expire in mere days, needed to be kept in the field, their momentum sustained. And so, against all conventional wisdom which dictated consolidating after a victory, Washington chose to recross the Delaware. On the 29th and 30th of December, in bitter cold but clear weather, the Continental Army returned to Trenton. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. He was placing his exhausted, shrinking army directly in the path of the inevitable British counterstroke. The reoccupation of Trenton was a sombre affair. The town bore the fresh scars of battle, looted Hessian stores, damaged houses, the lingering smell of gunpowder and blood. Washington positioned his forces not in the town itself, but on the south side of Assunpink Creek, a natural defensive line. The creek, though not wide, was steep-banked and icy, crossed by a narrow bridge and a few fords. He fortified this line, placing his artillery, now augmented by the captured Hessian guns, to command the approaches. It was a defensive posture, but an active one. He was daring Cornwallis to come and attack him on ground of his own choosing. This decision transformed the meaning of the Christmas raid. It was no longer a hit and run. It was the opening move in a bid to contest control of New Jersey. The stakes had been raised exponentially. Washington was betting his army and the revolution on his ability to fight a defensive battle and win, or to somehow outmaneuver the superior force he knew was marching toward him. The social and political landscape of New Jersey, meanwhile, underwent a subtle but rapid shift. The news of Trenton acted as a catalyst upon a population steeped in wary neutrality. The oppressive certainty of British control was broken. Militia companies which had dissolved weeks earlier began to reform. Individuals who had taken British protection oaths now found reasons to provide intelligence to the American camps. The victory did not turn New Jersey into a fervent patriot stronghold overnight, but it pierced the aura of British invincibility. It made the revolutionary cause look like a viable rather than a suicidal choice. This shift in the human terrain was a strategic asset Washington understood intuitively. Every farmer who hid a British patrol's movements, every local who shared news of Cornwallis's march, extended the senses of his threadbare army. The battle had been a military event. Its aftermath was becoming a political and psychological revolution. Lord Charles Cornwallis, a competent and energetic commander, moved with the methodical precision of the British military machine. By January 1st, 1777, he had concentrated a powerful force at Princeton, some 5,500 veteran British and Hessian troops, including grenadiers, light infantry, and dragoons. His intelligence, far better than Rawle's, informed him of Washington's recrossing and his position behind Assunpink Creek. Cornwallis's ambition was clear: to fix Washington in place and destroy him utterly, avenging Trenton and ending the rebellion in the Middle Colonies in one sharp, clinical operation. His fear, though he would not have framed it as such, was of a protracted, messy campaign in the depths of winter. He wanted a decisive battle, and he believed Washington, trapped with his back to the Delaware, had foolishly given it to him. On January 2nd, Cornwallis put his army in motion. The march from Princeton to Trenton, normally a few hours, became a grinding, day-long ordeal. Washington had dispatched a formidable delaying force of riflemen and light infantry under Colonel Edward Hand and others. These men, many of them frontiersmen, fought a brilliant rearguard action from fence line to woodlot, from ridge to stream, bleeding the British advance at every step. The British vanguard, expecting a clear road, found themselves in a running, bitter skirmish that consumed precious daylight and frayed tempers. Every mile was paid for in time and casualties. This was not the open field battle Cornwallis sought. It was a nettlesome, irregular conflict that played to American strengths. Late in the afternoon, the head of the British column finally reached the outskirts of Trenton and looked down toward Assunpink Creek. The sight that greeted Cornwallis was one of formidable defensive preparation. The American army was drawn up in battle order on the high ground south of the creek. The bridge was a deadly choke point covered by batteries of cannon. The fords, reported by scouts, appeared to be watched and fortified. Washington's army, though outnumbered nearly 2-1, looked determined and well posted. As the British deployed and launched probing attacks at the bridge and fords, they were met with crushing volleys of musketry and artillery fire. The fighting at the bridge in particular was fierce and bloody, with American lines holding firm and repelling several determined assaults. The day ended with a sharp, violent clash in the gathering dusk, after which the British fell back to regroup. It was now that Cornwallis, confident yet cautious, made a decision that would be debated by historians for centuries. His troops were weary from the march and the skirmishing. The American position appeared strong, a full-scale frontal assault across the creek in the failing light. promised heavy casualties. One of his generals, Sir William Erskine, is said to have urged an immediate attack. "My lord, if you trust those people tonight, you will see nothing of them in the morning." But Cornwallis, the professional soldier, opted for prudence. "We've got the old fox safe now," he reportedly replied. "We'll go over and bag him in the morning." He ordered his army to bivouac for the night, forming a loose cordon around the American position, believing Washington had no avenue of escape. The Delaware was at his back, the British army was in his front. The trap, it seemed, was perfect. In the American camp, the atmosphere was one of grim resolution shading into desperation. The defensive victory at the bridge had bolstered morale, but the strategic reality was inescapable. They were surrounded. The creek line might hold for one more assault, but against Cornwallis's full force, sustained pressure would inevitably break them. The Delaware, behind them, was once again clogged with ice. A retreat across it under attack would be a massacre. A council of war was held in a small house near the creek. The situation appeared hopeless. Yet, in the face of this apparent checkmate, Washington and his officers began to conceive a move of such daring that it defied the conventional military logic that had guided Cornwallis. They would not retreat. They would not stand and be crushed. They would slip away. The plan was born of absolute necessity and leveraged a profound understanding of their enemy's mindset. The British, confident in their encirclement, would be watching the creek and the river. They would not be watching their own rear. A local guide, perhaps a schoolmaster familiar with the farm lanes, informed the council of an unguarded road, a back road, that led from the American left skirting the British flank and wound its way northeast toward Princeton. If they could move silently, leaving their campfires burning and sentries posted, they could march around Cornwallis's army, strike his weakened base at Princeton, capture his supplies, and threaten his line of communication back to New Brunswick. It was a strategic maneuver worthy of the greatest captains of history. The decision was made. They would attempt it. The army would move out that very night. The night of January the 2nd, 1777 became a second chapter of silent, desperate movement, a bookend to the Christmas night crossing. Where the first march had been through a roaring storm, this one was undertaken in a profound, brittle cold, under a clear, starry sky that threatened betrayal with every creak of a wagon wheel. The stakes, if possible, were even higher. Failure meant walking directly into the heart of the British army or being caught strung out on the road at dawn. Muffling orders were passed down the line. Soldiers wrapped rags around their shoes and the wheels of the cannon carriages. The campfires along Assunpink Creek were fed and kept blazing brightly, maintained by a small detachment of men who would later slip away to follow. Sentries walked their posts with extra vigour, creating the illusion of a fully manned line. Just after midnight, the army began its stealthy exodus. It moved in a single long column, a serpent of suffering and resolve sliding out of the trap. Washington, Knox, Greene, and Sullivan moved among the men, whispering encouragement, enforcing absolute silence. The psychological strain was immense. Every man knew the British army lay sleeping just a few hundred yards to their right. The crunch of a single foot on frozen gravel, the snort of a horse, could awaken the lion and bring annihilation. Men held their breath as they passed by silent farmsteads. This was not the adrenaline-fueled advance on Trenton. This was a nerve-stretching exercise in collective discipline, a test of whether this citizen army could execute one of the most delicate maneuvers in warfare. The march along the Quaker road was a torment of cold and anxiety. The road was rough, little more than a frozen cart track. Progress was agonizingly slow, especially for Henry Knox's artillery train. Time, the silent enemy, pressed upon them. They needed to reach Princeton before Cornwallis, awakening at dawn, discovered their escape and either fell upon their rear or raced to intercept them. The column stretched and compressed, men stumbling in the dark, officers desperately trying to maintain cohesion without raising their voices. For Washington, these hours must have been an eternity of quiet dread. His entire strategy, the fruits of the Trenton victory, and the fate of the Revolution hung on the silence of his men and the continued slumber of the British sentries. As the first faint grey light began to seep into the eastern sky, the army was not yet at Princeton, but approaching a crucial fork in the road. The plan was to enter the town from the west, but here reality intruded with its typical indifference. Scouts brought word that a sizable British force, a brigade under Lieutenant Colonel Marhood, departing Princeton to join Cornwallis at Trenton, was on the main road, directly ahead and moving toward them. Washington's escaping army was on a collision course with a powerful enemy detachment. The strategic maneuver was about to degenerate into a meeting engagement, the very thing Washington had sought to avoid. There was no time for elaborate planning. The element of surprise, their greatest remaining asset, was still theirs, but it was a wasting commodity in the growing dawn. Washington acted with swift decision. He detached a portion of his force under General Hugh Mercer to swing left, seize a wooded hill overlooking the main Princeton-Trenton road, and delay or divert Marhood's column. The rest of the army would continue toward Princeton, but Mercer's movement was detected. Marhood, an alert and aggressive officer, saw troops on his flank and immediately recognized the stunning truth. The rebel army was not in its entrenchments at Trenton. It was here, in his rear. He wheeled his professional regiments, the 17th and 55th Foot, and advanced on Mercer's position. The resulting clash at William Clark's Orchard was sudden, violent, and initially went against the Americans. Mercer, fighting on foot with his sword, was surrounded by British regulars, bayoneted repeatedly, and left for dead. He would succumb to his wounds days later. His brigade began to falter and fall back in confusion. At this critical moment, with the carefully orchestrated night maneuver threatening to unravel into a rout on open ground, Washington himself galloped into the fray. He arrived to see Mercer's men retreating, with Marhood's jubilant redcoats in pursuit. Placing himself between the fleeing Americans and the advancing British, he waved his hat, calling for the Pennsylvanians and other militia to form. His presence was, once again, electrifying. The line steadied. Reinforcements from John Cadwalader's Philadelphia Associators came up at the double quick. Washington, exposed to intense musket fire, seemed a figure of impossible calm and authority, a bulwark against the tide of panic. As the American line reformed and began to deliver volleys, and as fresh troops under General John Sullivan pressed into Princeton itself, the tide of the small but intense battle began to turn. The Battle of Princeton, though smaller in scale than Trenton, was in many ways a more conventional and brutal affair. It was a meeting engagement fought in open fields and on the outskirts of a town, with less of the urban confinement that had characterized the earlier fight. As Sullivan's forces pushed into Princeton, they encountered stiff resistance from the British regiments left to garrison the town, holed up in Nassau Hall at the College of New Jersey. Henry Knox once again proved his mettle, directing a cannon to fire upon the venerable building. A few rounds were enough. A cannonball reportedly decapitated a portrait of King George II in the prayer hall, and the British garrison promptly surrendered. With Marhood's force now outflanked and retreating toward New Brunswick, and the Princeton garrison captured, Washington had achieved another startling victory. But there was no time to savour it. Cornwallis, awakening at dawn in Trenton to find an empty American camp, had been gripped by the fury of a man who realizes he has been duped. The sound of cannon fire from the north told the whole story. He immediately put his entire army on the road, force marching back toward Princeton in a rage, hoping to catch Washington between his hammer and the anvil of the remaining British forces in New Brunswick. Washington, ever conscious of the clock and the balance of forces, made another critical, disciplined decision. His men were again at the limit of endurance. Cornwallis's main army, fresh and furious, was only a few miles away. To stand and fight at Princeton would be to invite the general engagement he could not win. The objective had been achieved. They had escaped the trap, struck a blow, captured supplies, and thoroughly disrupted British plans. Now, they needed to live to fight another day. He ordered a swift gathering of prisoners and captured material, and then pointed the army not toward New Brunswick, which was heavily defended, but toward the relative safety of the rugged hills around Morristown, New Jersey. The immediate fallout of the Princeton campaign was a compound fracture of British strategy in New Jersey. In a span of 10 days, Washington had destroyed a Hessian brigade, outmaneuvered and humiliated Cornwallis's main army, captured 2 towns, and taken hundreds of prisoners. More importantly, he had forced the British to contract their defensive perimeter. Fearing for their supply lines, the British abandoned their forward posts across central New Jersey, retreating to a narrow corridor along the Raritan River between New Brunswick and the coast at Amboy. The pacification of New Jersey was undone. The psychological impact was even greater than that of Trenton alone. This was not a lucky raid, it was a campaign of superior generalship. The legend of Washington as the Old Fox was born in these days, a commander who could not be pinned down, who turned night, weather, and the assumptions of his enemies into weapons. For the Continental Army, the immediate consequence was survival, and more than survival, a renewed sense of identity. They had not only won a battle, they had executed a complex strategic retreat and countermarch, had fought and won a second engagement, and had then successfully disengaged from a superior force. They were no longer just survivors, they were a field army capable of operational artistry. The political fallout was immediate. The Continental Congress, emboldened, granted Washington sweeping powers for 6 months, effectively making him a military dictator in the interest of survival. His judgment had been vindicated. The victories also finally spurred longer-term enlistments. Men, inspired by success and the tangible proof of their own capability, signed on for 3 years or the duration of the war. The army that would eventually triumph at Yorktown began to take institutional shape in the aftermath of Princeton. In the quiet that settled over the frozen Jersey hills as the army established its winter quarters at Morristown, the characters of this drama were left to confront the outcomes of their actions. For George Washington, the triumphs of Trenton and Princeton brought not repose, but a heavier mantle of responsibility. He had saved the Revolution from immediate dissolution, but he understood the war was far from won. The British Empire was not so feeble that it would collapse from 2 sharp reverses. His actions had bought precious time and space, but the fundamental problems of supply, finance and organization remained, soon to be crystallized in the even more severe crucible of Valley Forge. The outcome he confronted was a reprieve, not a conclusion. His correspondence from Morristown shows a man relieved, grateful for the providential intervention of the weather and the spirit of his men, but already looking ahead to the next, inevitable test. The victories had confirmed his authority and deepened the almost mythical bond between him and his soldiers, but they had also raised expectations to a perilous height. For Lord Cornwallis, the outcome was one of profound professional humiliation. He was a talented general who had been outthought and outfought. His decision to wait until morning at Assunpink Creek would haunt his reputation, though in the strict rules of European warfare it had been the prudent choice. The campaign forced him to confront the unconventional nature of this war, where the enemy did not behave like a proper enemy, where terrain and audacity could negate numerical and professional superiority. This lesson, bitter as it was, may have informed his later, more aggressive and ultimately fatal campaigns in the South. For General Howe in New York, the outcomes were a massive strategic and political setback. The easy narrative of a concluded rebellion was shattered. He would have to explain the losses to London, and he would be forced to launch a new, major campaign in 1777, the ill-fated drive on Philadelphia, rather than consolidating his gains. The initiative, so firmly in British hands in December, had been wrenched away. For the Hessian prisoners, now marching into a long captivity, the outcome was the end of their American adventure in disgrace. Colonel Ryle was dead, his name a synonym for negligence. The captured soldiers faced years in prison camps, their fate a cautionary tale that would circulate through the German states, perhaps dampening enthusiasm for the lucrative trade in soldiers. For the people of New Jersey, the outcome was a liberation from the immediate presence of foreign troops, but also a realization that their land would remain a contested battleground. The brief campaign had shown them the ferocity of British reprisals and the fragility of American protection. Their loyalties would remain fraught and situational, a daily calculation of risk and survival. On a systemic level, the long-term impact of these 10 days in December and January was nothing less than the preservation of the American nation-state in embryo. The Continental Army as an institution was saved from oblivion. The French court, which had been watching with keen interest, saw in these victories evidence that the American rebellion was a serious military endeavor worthy of formal support. The path to the alliance of 1778 began on the road from Trenton to Princeton. The psychological impact on the British public and Parliament was significant, introducing doubt where there had been certainty, and making the war look less like a police action and more like a costly, uncertain conflict. Finally, the battles entered memory and began to forge a legacy. Even in the exhaustion of Morristown, the stories were being told and retold around campfires, of the ice-choked crossing, of the silent Hessians surprised at their breakfasts, of the commander standing fearless at the bridge and in the orchard. These stories became the foundational myths of the American military tradition, tales of endurance over privilege, of cunning over brute force, of the citizen soldier triumphing against the odds. The meaning of the events transcended their immediate military value. They became a symbol of the revolution's core premise, that resolve and ingenuity could challenge and overcome established power. The 10 crucial days did not win the war, but they made winning conceivable. They replaced the illusion of inevitable defeat with the enduring significance of improbable hope, an idea that would sustain the cause through the darker years still to come. The immediate echoes of the twin victories at Trenton and Princeton faded into the deep, watchful silence of the winter encampment at Morristown, New Jersey. Here, in the protective embrace of the Watchung Mountains, the Continental Army sought not just shelter from the cold, but a temporal sanctuary, a space to metabolize the shock of its own survival and to confront the daunting future it had purchased with its blood and suffering. The winter of 1776 to 1777 was not the end of a struggle, but a precarious intermission, a breath drawn in a room where the walls were still stained with smoke and the air still crackled with unresolved tension. The social order of the rebellion, which had been teetering on the edge of collapse, had been stabilized, not by a final resolution, but by a dramatic, temporary reprieve. A new, fragile hierarchy now asserted itself, one where the authority of General Washington, solidified by success, was supreme, yet where the old fundamental problems of the colonial coalition, regional distrust, logistical frailty, the tension between individual liberty and military discipline, merely lay dormant beneath a thin crust of renewed hope. The British High Command in New York, meanwhile, was plunged into a period of furious recalculation and recrimination. The easy confidence of December had evaporated, replaced by a prickly, humiliated vigilance. General William Howe, his plans for a quiet winter and a decisive spring campaign in tatters, was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that the war was not only ongoing but had entered a new, more virulent phase. The enemy was no longer a disintegrating mob but a force capable of operational artistry. Howe's response was a combination of strategic contraction and punitive action. He pulled his forces back from their exposed outposts in New Jersey, consolidating his hold on a narrow corridor between New York City and the outpost at New Brunswick. This was a tacit admission that the pacification of New Jersey had failed, yet in withdrawing he unleashed a different kind of warfare, Loyalist and regular cavalry patrols ranged through the countryside with orders to be severe, to burn the farms of suspected rebels, to make examples of those who had aided Washington. The Jerseys became a no-man's land of skirmish and atrocity, a hidden war of raids and reprisals that deepened the social schism and made neutrality an ever more dangerous stance. Into this tense landscape stepped new characters, their ambitions and fears shaped by the fresh contours of the conflict. For the American cause, men like the young Alexander Hamilton, who had distinguished himself at Trenton and Princeton, began to rise from the miasma of hardship. Washington, recognizing his brilliance, plucked him from his artillery company to serve as an aide-de-camp, bringing him into the innermost circle of command. Hamilton's ambition was volcanic, his desire for glory and order immense. His fear was that the revolution would fail through incompetence and parochialism. His presence at headquarters introduced a new, fiercely intellectual and administrative energy, but also a new source of friction with older, more established officers. From Europe, whispers and agents began to arrive in greater numbers. Soldiers of fortune like the young Marquis de Lafayette and the stern Prussian Baron von Steuben were making their way across the Atlantic, drawn by the romantic glow of the cause, now noticeably brighter after Trenton. They brought with them European ambitions for honour and advancement, and European fears of obscurity and failure, soon to be tested in the brutal, unceremonious theatre of American war. Most crucially, the character of the common soldier began to evolve. The men who had re-enlisted after the victories were a different breed from the short-term militiamen of 1776. They were for the duration, a phrase that carried the weight of an unknowable future. Their ambition was simple: to see the thing through, to survive, and to secure the independence they had been promised. Their fears were more immediate: disease, starvation, the gnawing uncertainty of a conflict without visible end. The shared ordeal of the 10 crucial days had forged a stronger, if more weary, bond among them. They had a collective identity now, a veteran's pride, but with it came a veteran's cynicism toward the distant Congress and the comfortable populace. A hidden tension was thus established between the army and the society it was defending, a tension between sacrifice and comfort, between the suffering of the camp and the political machinations of Philadelphia. In Morristown, Washington faced a command challenge as profound as any battlefield confrontation. He had to transform the spirit of desperate resilience that won at Trenton into the institutional backbone of a standing army. This meant drilling, disciplining, and supplying his men through one of the harshest winters of the century. The camp, scattered across frozen hills, was a scene of grim endurance. Smallpox erupted, a silent killer more feared than British muskets. Washington, in a moment of decisive and controversial leadership, ordered mass inoculations, a risky, cutting-edge medical procedure that saved the army from biological annihilation. This decision, born of fear for his army's survival, showcased his willingness to embrace innovation when tradition offered only death. It was an internal battle, fought not with bayonets but with lancets and quarantine, and its victory was as vital as any won on the field. The contradictions of Washington's role were laid bare. He was both a traditional patriarch and a revolutionary pragmatist, a conservator of his army's life who was forced to gamble with it daily in new and terrifying ways. Beyond the picket lines of Morristown and the occupied comforts of New York, the political and social landscape of the nascent United States underwent a profound, if uneven, transformation in the wake of the winter victories. The near collapse of the cause had been averted, but the revelation of how close it had come to disintegration left a permanent scar on the political consciousness of the rebellion. The Continental Congress, trickling back to Philadelphia from Baltimore, found itself in a paradox of empowerment and inadequacy. Washington's success had saved them, but it had also highlighted their own catastrophic failure to supply and support the army. The near-mythical status Washington now enjoyed made him politically untouchable, but it also set a precedent of military authority that would subtly undermine civilian control for the remainder of the war. Ambition in Congress now had to contend with the shadow of the commander-in-chief, a dynamic that bred both cooperation and quiet resentment. The social order within the states themselves was riven with new tensions. The British withdrawal from most of New Jersey did not bring peace but a bitter civil conflict. Neighbours who had taken British protection oaths now faced the wrath of returning Patriot committees. Suspected loyalists saw their property confiscated or were driven into exile in New York, creating a resentful refugee population that would fuel loyalist military units for years to come. The conflict had become, in many communities, a personal and irreconcilable feud. This internal strife was the dark underbelly of the patriotic resurgence. For every militiaman inspired to take up arms after Trenton, there was a family torn apart by suspicion and vengeance. The revolution was not just a war against a distant king, it was a violent reorganization of local power and loyalty, an unresolved conflict that the battlefields had merely inflamed. Financially, the system was in a state of accelerating collapse. The continental currency, printed to fund the war, began its infamous descent into worthlessness. The victories did not fill the treasury. They increased the demand for supplies that Congress had no hard money to purchase. This economic destabilization created a hidden rivalry between the army and the civilian population. Farmers, fearing payment in devalued paper, withheld their produce from army purchasers, leading to accusations of profiteering and lack of patriotism. Soldiers, starving in their camps while civilians allegedly hoarded food, grew deeply embittered. The social contract of the revolution, shared sacrifice for a common goal, was being broken on the anvil of economic reality. The fear of bankruptcy and social unrest began to rival the fear of British arms. Internationally, the tremors of Trenton and Princeton were felt in the courts of Europe, most notably in Versailles. The French government under Foreign Minister Vergennes had been providing covert aid to the Americans but hesitated to enter a formal alliance, waiting for proof that the rebellion was a viable strategic bet. The reports of Washington's winter campaign provided that proof. It demonstrated resilience, tactical skill, and the continued existence of a fighting force. While the French would wait for the further confirmation of the American victory at Saratoga later in 1777, the path to the crucial alliance was paved by the daring on the Delaware. This introduced a new, complex layer of ambition and fear, American ambition for a powerful ally that could tip the scales, paired with the fear of becoming a pawn in a larger global conflict between France and Britain. The French, for their part, were ambitious to humble their ancient rival, but fearful of overcommitting to a lost cause. The unresolved conflict between American desire for immediate support and French caution created a diplomatic dance of immense consequence. Within the army, the psychological strain of the underdog had been alleviated, only to be replaced by the strain of sustained expectation. The men were no longer the last forlorn hope. They were the instrument of a cause that had regained its momentum. This brought a different kind of pressure. They had to prove Trenton was not a fluke. The arrival of European officers like the 19-year-old Lafayette, who joined Washington's family as a volunteer major general without pay, created both inspiration and subtle friction. The aristocratic young Frenchman's zeal and courage were undeniable, but his rapid elevation rankled some American officers who had endured the brutal climb from the bottom. This introduced a hidden rivalry between native experience and foreign prestige, between the hard-won competence of the survivor and the theoretical expertise of the European professional. The army was becoming a more complex, cosmopolitan, and internally competitive organism, a far cry from the simple, desperate band that had crossed the ice-choked river just months before. The incident that destabilized this fragile new status, Quo pushing the war from a state of winter stalemate into a new and violent phase, was not a single battle, but a vast, coordinated strategic decision made in London. Stung by the humiliation in New Jersey and determined to end the rebellion in a single decisive campaign, Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, approved an elaborate plan for 1777. It called for a multi-pronged offensive to sever the rebellious colonies in two. The main thrust, under General John Burgoyne, would drive south from Canada via Lake Champlain to capture Albany, New York. A supporting column under Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Leger would move east from Lake Ontario via the Mohawk Valley. The ultimate objective was to link up with General Howe's army, which was expected to move north from New York City up the Hudson River, completing a stranglehold on New England. This grand plan, however, contained the seeds of its own dysfunction, born of ambiguous orders and unresolved personal ambitions. General Howe, rather than focusing on supporting Burgoyne's northern campaign, had his own design. Still smarting from the embarrassment of Trenton and fixated on capturing the rebel capital, he secured permission to pursue his own objective, the seizure of Philadelphia. He believed that taking the political heart of the rebellion would deliver a mortal blow. This fundamental disconnect between a London-based strategy of division and a theatre commander strategy of symbolic conquest would prove catastrophic. The incident that would destabilise the British war effort was, therefore, a piece of parchment in London, granting too much latitude to a proud and aggrieved commander. It forced both British armies to react to plans that were not mutually supportive, scattering their strength and leaving Burgoyne to operate in a strategic vacuum. For George Washington, reacting to the movements of Howe's army became the all-consuming task of the summer and fall of 1777. The American commander, his army strengthened in numbers but still racked by supply woes, had to discern his enemy's true intent. Was the target the Hudson Highlands to link with Burgoyne, or was it Philadelphia, as intelligence suggested? Washington's fear was of being outmaneuvered, of guessing wrong and leaving a vital avenue exposed. His ambition was to fight a defensive battle on favourable ground, another Princeton, to bleed the British without risking his army's destruction. As Howe loaded his army onto a massive fleet of ships in New York Harbour in July and sailed south, not north, the picture clarified but also complicated. The British were bypassing the overland route through New Jersey, choosing a seaborne invasion of Pennsylvania. Washington was forced to react by marching his army across New Jersey to defend Philadelphia, a grueling movement in the summer heat that tested his men's endurance anew. The British landing at the head of the Chesapeake Bay in late August placed the two armies on a collision course for the rich farmlands of southeastern Pennsylvania. The reaction within the American ranks was a mixture of grim determination and anxious speculation. To defend Philadelphia was to fight for a symbol, but the city was militarily indefensible. Washington would have to intercept Howe in the field. The tension within his command structure resurfaced under this pressure. His generals were divided. Some, like the aggressive Anthony Wayne and the itching for a fight John Sullivan, advocated for a bold stand. Others, remembering the disasters of 1776 around New York, urged caution. Washington, his authority now towering but his strategic judgment still evolving, sought a middle path. He would offer battle but from a strong defensive position. He chose ground along the banks of Brandywine Creek, a natural barrier on the road to Philadelphia. The confrontation along the Brandywine on September 11, 1777, revealed the enduring strengths and weaknesses of both armies. Washington reacted to Howe's frontal demonstrations with firmness, holding the fords. But Howe, learning from the Trenton debacle, had not forgotten the flanking maneuvers that had served him so well on Long Island. While fixing the American center, he sent Cornwallis on a long, secret march to cross the Brandywine far to the north, replicating the strategy that had nearly destroyed Washington a year earlier. The American reaction to the discovery of this flanking force was one of desperate, piecemeal redeployment. Units were rushed north to meet the threat, arriving breathless and piecemeal to be chewed up by disciplined British lines. The battle was a severe American defeat, a tactical masterpiece by Howe that forced Washington into a disorganized retreat. The reaction in the aftermath was a profound test of the resilience born at Trenton. The army did not shatter. It fell back in relative order, lived to fight another day, but Philadelphia was lost. The city fell to the British on September 26th, a bitter political and psychological blow. The fall of Philadelphia forced a realignment of alliances and a severe testing of loyalties, both military and political. For the Continental Congress, it was a second ignominious flight, this time to York, Pennsylvania. Their authority, always fragile, diminished further. Loyalty to the congressional cause was now a matter of faith, not sight, as the seat of government was once again on the run. Within the army, defeat bred recrimination. Who was at fault for Brandywine? Was Washington's intelligence network deficient? Were his generals slow to react? The hidden rivalries and regional tensions simmered closer to the surface. Officers from different states blamed one another for the collapse of the flank. Yet, in the ranks, the loyalty forged in the snows of Princeton held surprisingly firm. The soldiers had been beaten, not broken. They trusted Washington's unwavering demeanor, his calm in retreat. Their loyalty was to him, personally, and to the shared identity of survivors, more than to the abstract Congress in exile. This period also saw the crystallization of a fierce, opposing ideological side within the American populace, the active, militant loyalists. Emboldened by Howe's capture of Philadelphia, they emerged from the shadows, enlisting in new provincial corps and engaging in vicious guerrilla warfare against their patriot neighbors. The war in the Middle Colonies became a three-sided conflict: the British regulars, the Continental Army, and a brutal civil war between factions of Americans. Alliances of convenience and terror formed. Patriots and loyalists each formed committees of safety to police their communities, meting out harsh justice to suspected turncoats. This internal conflict forced every individual and family to make perilous choices, testing loyalties to the breaking point and often beyond, leaving scars of betrayal and violence that would last for generations. On the grand strategic stage, the most critical alliance of the war was finally being cemented, an indirect consequence of the momentum that began at Trenton. In the north, General Burgoyne's campaign, advancing without the support of Howe's army, which was comfortably occupying Philadelphia, was meeting unexpected fierce resistance. American forces under Horatio Gates, Benedict Arnold, and Daniel Morgan were slowing his advance to a crawl in the dense forest north of Albany. The climactic battles at Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights in September and October culminated in Burgoyne's complete surrender at Saratoga on October 17, 1777. This stunning victory, the first time in world history a British army had surrendered in the field, was the direct result of British strategic disunity, a disunity made possible in part by Washington's earlier victories, which had redirected Howe's attention to Philadelphia. The news of Saratoga electrified Europe and delivered the final argument the French court needed. It proved the Americans could win a major conventional campaign. The victory was a product of many things: Burgoyne's arrogance, the terrain, the courage of American riflemen. But its foundation was the continued existence of a credible Continental Army, an institution that would not have existed without the resuscitating victories of the previous winter. In February 1778, France signed treaties of alliance and commerce with the United States, transforming the rebellion into a global war. This alliance, the dream of American diplomats, was the ultimate strategic outcome of the chain of events set in motion at Trenton. It introduced powerful new forces, the French Navy, French troops, French gold, but also new complexities and obligations. American loyalty was now pledged to a Bourbon monarch, an irony not lost on observers. The alliance was a marriage of convenience fraught with its own future tensions over strategy and war aims, but it was the decisive turning point in the struggle for independence. For Washington's army, however, the immediate aftermath of Brandywine and the loss of Philadelphia was not global diplomacy, but the bitter struggle for survival at a new winter camp, Valley Forge. The choice of this location in December 1777 was a strategic one, close enough to monitor the British in Philadelphia, yet defensible. But it was also an admission of logistical failure. The alliances between the states and the Congress had failed to provide for the army. The early decisions of the war, relying on short-term enlistments, printing money without backing, decentralizing supply, were now leading to their irreversible, tragic consequences. As the army shivered in crude huts on the frozen plateau, starvation, disease, and desertion ravaged its ranks. The victories of Trenton and Princeton had bought time, but they had not solved the systemic rot. The test at Valley Forge was of a different, more fundamental kind, not of courage under fire, but of faith in the cause amidst unrelenting mundane suffering. The alliances within the army, between officers and men, between different state lines, were tested by shared misery as never before. The events of 1777, from the stalemate of Morristown to the defeat at Brandywine, the loss of Philadelphia, the triumph at Saratoga, and the descent into the abyss of Valley Forge, had accelerated far beyond the control of any single commander. The war had taken on a life of its own, governed by logistics, geopolitics, and the brutal logic of attrition. Washington, for all his increased authority, could not will food or shoes into existence. Howe, despite capturing the rebel capital, found his victory hollow, his army pinned in the city while the rebellion not only persisted but gained a European ally. Both men and the governments they served believed they could still manage the outcome. Howe thought holding Philadelphia would break rebel morale. Washington believed sheer perseverance at Valley Forge would preserve the army as a fighting force. Both views were partially correct, yet both failed to grasp that the conflict's center of gravity had shifted from specific geographic objectives to the endurance of the American state itself and the patience of the British public. The internal conflicts and moral ambiguities of the struggle deepened unbearably in this period. For the American soldier at Valley Forge, the cause was measured in empty bellies and frostbitten feet. The lofty ideals of the Declaration seemed a cruel joke when Congress could not provide blankets. The moral ambiguity of their sacrifice was stark. Were they patriots or dupes? For officers like Nathaniel Greene, who reluctantly accepted the role of quartermaster general, the task was a moral quagmire. To feed the army, he was forced to requisition supplies from a reluctant, often hostile countryside, using the very impressment practices that the British had been condemned for. The line between liberation and oppression blurred in the desperate struggle to keep the army alive. The psychological strain on Washington was immense. His letters from Valley Forge are portraits of a man bearing the weight of a collective suffering he could not alleviate, pleading, cajoling, and threatening a political body that seemed incapable of action. The fear of mutiny or dissolution was a constant gnawing companion. Yet, within this cauldron of suffering, a profound transformation was underway, one that would have been impossible without the veteran corps preserved by the victories of late 1776. In the early spring of 1778, a figure arrived who would become the architect of the army's professional soul, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. A Prussian veteran with a talent for theatre and drill, Steuben did not speak English, but he understood discipline. Appointed as acting inspector general, he began the Herculean task of drilling the Laos, ragged continentals, into a cohesive professional force. His genius was not in introducing new tactics, but in simplifying and standardizing them, creating a unified system of maneuver for the entire army. He worked not with the hauteur of a European martinet, but with a profane, passionate energy that won the respect of the soldiers. The man who taught the drills was a sergeant major, yelling translated curses through an interpreter. The Baron moved among the officers, instilling the principles of command. The transformation was as much psychological as it was military. Steuben's training gave the army a renewed sense of pride and purpose. The shared suffering of the winter became a shared accomplishment. They were no longer just men enduring, they were soldiers mastering their craft. This was the irreversible consequence of choosing to stay, of the re-enlistments after Trenton. The army that emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. It was lean, hardened, and for the first time, truly disciplined. It was an instrument capable of meeting the British regulars in open field on equal terms, a fact it would prove at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in June. The long-term impact of this period was the institutionalization of the Revolution. The near-death experience of 1776 and the purgatorial suffering of 1777 forged not just an army, but a professional officer corps and a deeper, if more complicated, national identity. The hidden tensions between states, between soldiers and civilians, between idealism and necessity, were not resolved, but they were contained within a structure that could now withstand them. The system, however flawed, had survived its greatest internal stress test. The meaning of the events from Trenton to Valley Forge was becoming clear. Independence would not be won by a single brilliant stroke, but by the brutal, grinding capacity to endure, adapt, and outlast the will of the enemy. The enduring significance lay in the proof that a republic, for all its inefficiencies and internal conflicts, could muster the resilience to sustain a protracted war against a monarchy, provided it had a core of believers hardened in the fire of its own desperation. The stage was now set not for a quick conclusion, but for a long, drawn-out war of attrition, where the resilience born on the banks of the Delaware would be the new nation's most vital weapon. The echoes of the cannonade at Trenton did not fade with the melting of the winter's snow, nor with the bloom of spring at Valley Forge, nor even with the final victory at Yorktown. They reverberated through the remaining years of the war and into the very soul of the nascent republic, transforming from a report of artillery into a foundational chord in the national melody. The immediate, desperate need for survival had been met, but the deeper, more profound need for meaning was only beginning to be addressed. In the camps, the council chambers, and the humble homes of a continent, the participants and observers of those 10 crucial days began the lifelong work of confronting the outcomes of their actions, of sifting through the chaos of event to find the ore of legacy. The battle had been a hinge upon which history turned, but its ultimate significance would be forged in the slower fires of memory, interpretation, and the arduous construction of a national identity. For the soldiers who had survived the crossing and the fight, the outcome was a permanent alteration of their own self-conception. The farmer from Pennsylvania, the fisherman from Marblehead, the apprentice from Philadelphia, they had been forged into veterans in a single frozen morning. They carried with them ever after the knowledge of what they had endured and what they had accomplished against impossible odds. This knowledge bred a quiet, unshakable confidence that would sustain them through the dreary campaigns to come. But they also carried the scars, physical and psychological. The outcomes they confronted were not merely glory, but the lingering ache of frost-nipped limbs, the nightmares of ice-choked rivers, and the hollow memory of friends who had marched but not returned. Their victory was personal, visceral, and costly. In the later years of the war, when morale again ebbed, the story of Trenton became a talisman they passed to new recruits. We have been lower than this, and we prevailed. We know what can be done. For General George Washington, the confrontation with the outcomes was a continuous living process of leadership. Trenton and Princeton had not solved his problems. They had transformed their nature. He was no longer the commander of a dissolving mob, but the celebrated leader of a cause with a future. This brought a heavier, more complex burden. Every subsequent decision was measured against the brilliance of that winter gamble. Could he replicate it? Should he even try, or was his role now that of the careful conservator, the Fabian general who must preserve the army until French power could be brought to bear? The victories had saved his reputation, but they had also crystallized his symbolic role as the indispensable man. He confronted the outcome of his own myth-making, finding himself trapped within the expectations of a public that now saw him as invincible. His correspondence reveals a man deeply aware of this, constantly tempering public euphoria with private caution, knowing that one misstep could shatter the precious faith that Trenton had restored. The British High Command, from Howe to Germain to a dismayed King George III, confronted an outcome of profound strategic failure. The swift, cheap suppression of the rebellion was now impossible. Trenton had proven the rebellion's resilience. Saratoga, made possible by the strategic breathing room Trenton provided, had internationalized the conflict. The outcome they faced was a global war of attrition against France, Spain, and Holland, with the American theatre becoming a bloody, expensive sideshow. For career officers like Cornwallis, the lesson of Trenton, the danger of American daring and terrain, was learned imperfectly. He would carry a mix of contempt and wary respect south in 1780, where his aggressive pursuit of victory would ultimately lead him to his own, far more definitive entrapment at Yorktown. The British confronted the outcome of their own professional arrogance, a belief in systemic and racial superiority that had been punctured first by the rifles at Concord, and then decisively by the cannons on the high ground above Trenton. On a societal level, the people of the 13 states confronted an outcome of clarified and now inescapable commitment. The comfortable pre-war social order was gone forever. The moderate who had hoped for reconciliation now had to choose. The loyalist, whose position had seemed secure in December 1776, found himself endangered and often exiled by January 1777. The victory injected a potent dose of confidence into the patriot cause, radicalizing its policies. Confiscation of loyalist property, mandatory loyalty oaths, and the relentless demands of war finance became the new norm. The battle's outcome was, therefore, a catalyst for internal revolution, forcing a violent sorting of the population and a definitive break from the old colonial identity. The spirit of 76 was no longer just the spirit of declaration. After Trenton, it became the spirit of emboldened, often ruthless self-assertion. The long-term impact on the systems of war and governance was profound and far-reaching. The Continental Army, as an institution, was the direct beneficiary. The near catastrophe of 1776 and the miraculous recovery became the central parable in the argument for a professional, standing military, a controversial concept in a republic born of suspicion toward standing armies. Washington and his supporters, like Alexander Hamilton, would point to the ragged, expiring militia of December and the disciplined, re-enlisted Continentals of January as proof positive that liberty could only be secured by a professional force loyal to the nation, not to a state. This belief, born in the desperation before Trenton and solidified after it, would fuel the post-war debates that led to the Constitutional Convention and the establishment of a stronger federal government with the power to raise and maintain an army. The outcome of the battle was thus woven into the very fabric of the US Constitution. Financially, the impact was more destructive but equally transformative. The war effort, saved from immediate collapse, continued to be funded by the reckless printing of continental currency, leading to hyperinflation and the phrase "not worth a continental." The economic chaos of the late war years and the inability of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation to solve it became the primary impetus for the creation of a federal power to regulate commerce and levy taxes. The men who had shivered at Trenton for lack of pay and supplies became, in the 1780s, the political leaders who demanded a government capable of fulfilling its promises to soldiers and creditors alike. The financial trauma of the war, a trauma deferred but not avoided by the victories of late 1776, directly shaped the economic clauses of the Constitution. Internationally, the long-term impact was the establishment of the United States as a credible actor on the world stage. Before Trenton, the rebellion was a colonial insurgency. After the twin victories, and especially after the French alliance they facilitated, it became a state in formation with powerful allies. The diplomatic recognition that followed changed global geopolitics. The outcome for the European powers was a significant rebalancing. Britain was weakened, France was emboldened, a move that would contribute to its own financial ruin and revolution, and a new disruptive republican principle was introduced into the Atlantic world. The Battle of Trenton, therefore, can be traced in a direct line to the diplomatic revolutions of the late 18th century, its ripples extending far beyond the banks of the Delaware. For the art and science of warfare, the battle had a quieter but enduring impact. It was studied as a masterpiece of operational daring and the exploitation of weather and terrain. It validated the potential of mobile, light infantry and the critical importance of intelligence and surprise, lessons that would influence military thinkers for generations. It also stood as a timeless case study in the psychology of command. Washington's decision to attack when logic dictated retreat, and his even more audacious decision to recross the river, became textbook examples of moral courage and the seizure of initiative. In military academies, the campaign would be taught not just as an American story, but as a universal lesson in the dynamics of asymmetric warfare. Most pervasively, the long-term impact was on the collective memory and character of the American people. The narrative that emerged was one of divine providence and innate resilience. The howling storm was not just bad weather, it was a shield provided by fate. The exhausted men were not just victims, they were instruments of a higher purpose. This narrative of miraculous intervention in the darkest hour became a core tenet of American exceptionalism. It fostered a belief that the nation, like its first army, possessed a unique capacity for regeneration against the odds. This belief would be invoked in later crises, the Civil War, the Great Depression, global conflicts, serving as a deep cultural reservoir of hope. The outcome of the battle in this sense was the gift of a perpetual symbol, the idea that dawn's victory is always possible after the longest, coldest night. As the years lengthened into decades, the living memory of the battle gave way to the polished sheen of national myth. The participants themselves became relics, their personal stories curated and often sanitized for public consumption. Veterans, their bent frames paraded at 4th of July celebrations, were no longer just men who had suffered, but living monuments to the birth of the Republic. The chaotic truth of the event, the frozen corpses, the panicked Hessians, the desperate silent theft of a march on a sleeping enemy, was gradually overlaid with a more heroic, palatable imagery. In paintings like Emanuel Leutz's iconic but historically fanciful Washington Crossing the Delaware, 1851, the reality of cramped anonymous fishermen poling through jagged ice was transformed into a majestic staged tableau of destiny. Washington stands nobly, knee-bent, staring into a dramatically lit future, while a diverse cast of archetypal patriots rows him toward glory. The truth of collective anonymous exertion was replaced by the myth of singular visionary leadership. This process of myth-making served a vital national purpose. In the early 19th century, as sectional tensions threatened the union forged by war, the story of Trenton served as a unifying national origin myth. It was a story in which Yankees and Virginians, merchants and farmers had stood together. The Hessians were the faceless other against which a diverse America could define itself. The battle's legacy was thus harnessed for political unity, its complexities flattened into a simple parable of unity and triumph. The reflection on its meaning became less about historical analysis and more about civic religion, a sacred story to be recited for inspiration rather than questioned for understanding. For historians and writers, the battle posed a perennial challenge: how to reconcile the myth with the documents. They confronted the outcomes of the participants' own carefully crafted narratives, Washington's modest official reports, the self-justifying memoirs of junior officers, the silent absence of the common soldier's diary, for few could write. The legacy was one of interpretative struggle. The spirit of 76 was invoked by every political movement, from abolitionists to expansionists, each claiming the mantle of those freezing patriots. The meaning of the event was not fixed. It was a contested space reflecting the evolving values and conflicts of the nation itself. To reflect on Trenton was, and is, to reflect on what America believes itself to be at any given moment. A nation of underdogs, of practical innovators, of providential favourites, or of relentless strugglers. The physical landscape of Trenton itself became a site of legacy and reflection. The battlefield was slowly encroached upon by the growing city, its exact contours lost. Courts and government buildings rose over ground where grenadiers had fallen. This very obscurity became part of its meaning. Unlike the vast preserved fields of Gettysburg or Yorktown, Trenton's significance was swallowed by mundane progress, a metaphor for how the extraordinary becomes embedded in the ordinary life of a nation. Memorials were erected, a statue here, a plaque there, but the true monument was the continued existence of the country itself. To walk the streets of modern Trenton is to walk over a palimpsest, where the drama of founding is buried beneath layers of everyday American life, a silent foundational tremor under the pavement. On a human level, the final reflection is on the nature of legacy itself. For Colonel Johann Roll, his legacy was one of tragic error, a name synonymous with fatal overconfidence. For the young James Monroe and William Washington, their wounds at Trenton were the first lines in resumes that would lead to the presidency and a generalship, respectively. For the thousands of unknown participants, their legacy was the unmarked collective achievement that made those individual destinies possible. The enduring significance of the event lies in this interplay between the famous and the forgotten, the decisive choice of the commander and the anonymous endurance of the rank and file. It reminds us that history's great turns often hinge not on vast impersonal forces alone, but on the applied will of individuals, cold, scared and determined, moving one frozen foot after another toward an uncertain dawn. The silence that followed the last musket shot in Trenton was not an emptiness, but a fertile ground from which meanings proliferated. In the quiet of reflection, the deeper philosophical significances of the event come into focus, transcending the tactical and even the political to touch on universal human themes. The Battle of Trenton endures not merely because it was a victory, but because it represents a specific, powerful archetype, the triumph of will over circumstance, of hope over despair, of action over acceptance. It is the moment when a narrative of inevitable decline was forcibly rewritten into a narrative of possible ascent. The enduring significance lies first in its demonstration of psychological warfare's primacy. Washington understood that his most dangerous enemy in December 1776 was not the Hessian brigade, but the despair within his own army and the contempt within the enemy's. The attack on Trenton was, at its core, a surgical strike aimed at these psychological conditions. Its objective was as much to inject hope into one side as it was to shatter confidence on the other. In this, it was brilliantly successful. The battle thus stands as a timeless lesson in the art of command, which is less about moving pieces on a map than about managing the human spirit, the fears and hopes of one's own men and the perceptions of the foe. It is a case study in the fact that wars are won in the mind before they are won on the field. Furthermore, the event carries enduring significance as a referendum on leadership in crisis. Washington's decision to attack defied all conventional military logic. A prudent conventional commander would have retreated further, sought shelter, and accepted dissolution. His choice was an act of creative destruction, risking the little he had left on the chance to create something new. This model of leadership, which embraces high risk in the face of certain catastrophe, has resonated far beyond military circles. It speaks to entrepreneurs, artists, social reformers, and anyone facing a seemingly terminal setback. The crossing of the Delaware has become a metaphor for that point of no return, the decisive leap taken when all other options are worse. The battle also holds a profound, if somber, significance regarding the role of chance and contingency in history. What if the storm had not concealed the crossing? What if a Hessian patrol had been more vigilant? What if the ice had made the river truly impassable? The victory balanced on a razor's edge of fortunate and weather and enemy error. This injects a note of humility into the triumphant narrative. It suggests that great historical turns are not always the inevitable product of deep forces, but can be the fragile offspring of luck, timing, and the exploitation of fleeting opportunity. The legacy of Trenton, therefore, includes an acknowledgement of the precariousness of history itself, a reminder that the world we know was built on a foundation of chance occurrences seized by prepared minds. On a national level, the enduring significance is the birth of the American way of war, or at least its foundational myth. It prized adaptability over tradition, pragmatic effectiveness over ceremonial form, and the clever use of terrain and weather over the rigid formalism of the European line. The citizen soldier, fighting for a cause with a mix of idealism and practical skill, defeated the professional mercenary. This narrative, however oversimplified, established a self-perception that would influence American military doctrine and national self-image for centuries. It fostered a belief in the resourceful amateur, the ingenious underdog, a theme that runs from the Minutemen to the Apollo program. Finally, Trenton holds significance as a moment of moral and existential choice. The men who crossed the river that night were not compelled by a dictator's decree. They were following a commander whose authority rested on their continued consent. They chose to endure the unbearable for an idea, the idea of a republic. In the darkness and the ice, the abstract principles of the Declaration of Independence were translated into the most concrete physical suffering. The battle thus represents the terrible, beautiful moment when philosophy meets reality, when high-minded ideals are paid for in the currency of frozen flesh and spilled blood. It answers the perennial question of whether an idea is strong enough to sustain mortal hardship. On December 26, 1776, the answer, miraculously, was yes. That yes echoes as the most enduring significance of all, a testament to the power of a shared belief to alter the course of the world. As the final embers of memory from the revolutionary generation flickered out, the Battle of Trenton settled into its permanent station in the American firmament, no longer a lived experience but a permanent star in the constellation of national identity. Its meaning became both fixed in ritual and endlessly adaptable to the needs of the present. It is the story told to school children, the painting reproduced on postage stamps, the metaphor invoked by politicians in times of national trial. To reflect on its legacy today is to engage in a conversation with the many layers of meaning accrued over 2.5 centuries, to separate the historical bedrock from the sedimentary layers of myth, and to understand why this brief, brutal encounter in a small New Jersey town retains its powerful grip on the imagination. The reflection on legacy must first return to the quiet, personal transformations it wrought. For every survivor, the battle was a dividing line in their life, a before and after defined by cold, violence, and an unexpected grace. That personal legacy of transformed identity, multiplied by thousands, became the collective legacy of a people who now believed themselves capable of self-creation. The meaning of the event for them was not about grand strategy, but about a proven capacity to endure the unendurable and emerge, battered but intact, on the other side. This is the most human and accessible layer of its significance, a story of collective grit. Yet the legacy is also inextricably tied to the man who has become its personification, George Washington. Trenton was the crucible that purified his leadership, burning away the doubts of the New York campaign and revealing the steely core of resolve that would define his character for history. It cemented the bond of trust between him and his men that was the Army's greatest strength. His legacy as the father of his country finds one of its primary sources in the faith earned on the banks of the Assunpink Creek. The battle's meaning is thus woven into the American archetype of the leader, stoic, persevering, sharing the danger, and defiant in the face of long odds. It established a standard against which all future national leaders would be, often unfairly, measured. In the long sweep of history, the Battle of Trenton's most concrete legacy is the existence of the United States of America as a sovereign nation. It is the keystone in the arch of the Revolution. Remove it, and the entire structure of 1775-1783 likely collapses into a footnote of failed colonial rebellions. By preserving the Continental Army, it made possible everything that followed: the French alliance, the endurance to Yorktown, the diplomatic settlement in Paris. The chain of causation is clear, therefore its enduring significance is nothing less than the creation of the modern world's first great republic, a political experiment that would reshape global politics, inspire revolutions, and challenge millennia of monarchical tradition. But perhaps the most profound reflection is on the nature of history itself. Trenton teaches that history is not a smooth, inevitable river, but a series of precarious cascades and unexpected turns. It reminds us that moments of profound crisis are also moments of profound possibility, that the edge of the abyss can be a launching point. The 10 crucial days stand as a monument to human agency in the face of deterministic forces. The British Empire, with all its power, had a logic of victory. The collapsing American cause had a logic of defeat. Washington and his men introduced a third logic, the logic of the desperate, creative gamble. They chose to make their own history. And so, for your sleepy videos, as the narration weaves through the ice and the gloom, the musketry, and the silent march, let the final, lingering note be one of resonant possibility. The Battle of Trenton is more than a military engagement, it is a perennial source code for resilience. In the depth of winter they struck a spark. That spark lit a campfire that warmed a starving army, then a beacon that drew a mighty ally, and finally a torch that helped illuminate the principles of a new nation. Its sound, across the gulf of years, is not the roar of cannon, but the persistent quiet whisper that in the longest night, a determined few, by the simple agonizing act of moving forward, can indeed bring about the dawn. That is its story. That is its meaning. That is its endless quiet echo.